Firstly, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Professor Hamad Vares for including me in this wonderful initiative and to the opportunity that all the organizer of this stimulating academic discussion have given me. So, between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Europe underwent a series of significant change affecting the rural society. This included the industrialization, urbanization, increasing commercialization, and the technological development. Although not entirely new, this phenomena acquired greater importance than in the past and brought about significant transformation in agricultural holdings and in the relationship between owners and workers, as well as between capital and labor. Against this backdrop, there were serious concerns about whether there was still a place for agriculture, and more specifically for the rural economy. It is worth noting that both theoretical and political positions regarding this significant change were contradictory. On the one hand, the Marxist theory stressed the emergence of the large capitalist corporation that would eventually wipe out the small family farms by initiating a process of collectivization and socialization of the land. While, in the other hand, proposals in other European countries highlighted the moral, social, technological, and productive superiority of agriculture. Based on this perspective, some scholars justified the survival of small family farms in terms of economy efficiency. The echoes of this debate soon reverberated in Italy, where, after the political unification in 1861, the civil legal matter was enacted in 1865. The new civil code intended to rule civil relations in society resembled the Napoleonic code in both structure and content, thus giving a central role to property. It emphasized the right to enjoy and dispose of the things in absolute manner, with the only restriction that the use must be consistent with both law and regulation. Wherever this code lacked any provision on agricultural property, and largely on the means of movement of related goods. Unfortunately, this gap was not filled by the Commercial Code of 1892 either. As a matter of fact, Article 5 of the Commercial Code only excluded the commercial nature of the alienation of agricultural product by the farmer or the owner of the land. In the second half of the 19th centuries, agriculture in the strict sense of the word still referred to human activity directed towards the cultivation of the land, although some confusion about the meaning of the term agriculture led to the inclusion of related activities such as animal husbandry, horticulture, floriculture, and gardening. The farmer needed a means of carrying out this activity, either as a owner, as a holder of a right to ram, such as usufruct or emphyteusis, or as an owner in good faith or in bad faith. Wherever, this situation entailed disadvantages. For instance, it implied the disparity in economy power between those who could use the land speculatively, such as the owners, and those who had to use the agricultural resources of the land. This issue was inextricably linked to another, that of which family farms were most common in rural areas. Years before political unification, the Italian countryside was populated by colonial families, sharecroppers, and peasants who had worked the same land for generations without formally owning it. This reality was firmly rooted in various parts of Italy, and yet, as we have seen, completely ignored by both the Civil Code and the Commercial Code. In the absence of any provision, relationship within these rural communities continued to be ruled by the tacit family community, which was already provided for in some pre-unification code. In particular, according to this model, in the event of the death of the head of the family, the children, siblings, or grandchildren tacitly kept the property undivided and continued the economic activity exercised by the deceased, thus maintaining a community of life, interests, and activities under the direction of new head, chosen by agreement and representing the various members of the family vis-à-vis to third parties. This criticism resurfaced in the first post-war period, placing the agrarian issue at the center of the Italian political plan. Undoubtedly, World War I had accelerated the change, strengthening the industrial structure and increasing the degree of commercialization of agriculture. Furthermore, the high inflation of agricultural price implied a disruptive effect on the incomes of the sharecroppers who had invested their savings in purchasing land. This contributed to the creation of new large nucleus of small landowners who were rapidly changing the Italian countryside, especially in the north. At the same time, the expectation that arose during the most dramatic phases of the war, summed up in the slogan "Land for the peasant," materialized in the occupation of uncultivated land. In the sharecropping areas, the newly formed White and Red Leagues, trade union organization of peasants inspired by Catholicism and Socialism respectively, fought for a complete revision of the work condition that landowners had previously agreed upon with the peasant. During this period, the conflict between capital and labor was intense, and even the government was unable to channel this phenomena into clear reform solution. The solution to such a problematic situation was ultimately found by the peasants themselves, through an alliance with the fascist movement, which used violence to systematically suffocate the peasant and the sharecropping movements. Despite the recourse to the force, during the 20 years of fascism, agriculture and mostly the rural world assumed a fundamental importance in the ideological apparatus promoted by the regime. Indeed, the land was not simply an economic activity accompanying the industrial and commercial field. On the contrary, it represented a guarantor of social balance and moral stability. This value was perfectly embodied in the rural sharecropping family, which became one of the most significant archetypes of fascist ethics. In the years immediately following the March on Rome, a series of legislative measures, particularly in the field of agriculture, led the Italian scholars to rethink the main categories of private law and, more generally, the blurry distinction between public and private law. In this light, the debate on the transformation of property was of utmost importance. In 1901, the civil law scholar Francesco emphasized the sacred nature of the private property, drawing on the myth established by Napoleonic codification and linking this concept to the individual's personality and freedom. Despite this assumption, the most convincing justification for preserving the property as an individual right of man began to shift towards its social function. Then he argued that individual property must be maintained because it is also socially useful to ensure the owner's interest in the maximum production of wealth. According to this innovative perspective, the owner's freedom to use and dispose of their property had to consider its social usefulness. The legislation enacted during the war brought about a rapid acceleration and significant change in private law, especially that concerning the social function on private property. At the end of the 19th century, two illustrious Italian jurists faced the difficult task of reporting this change. Filippo Vassalli, the father of the future Civil Code of 1942, and Enrico Finzi, known as the solitary innovator. During a memoir read at Accademia dei Georgofili on May 20, years 1923, Filippo Vassalli definitively excluded the reassession of the purported social law from the realm of civil reforms, particularly concerning land ownership, which remained centered on strictly individualistic assets. Diametrically opposed was the judgment formulated by Arrigo Finzi in his famous speech for the inauguration of the academic year 1922-1923 at the University Cesare Alfieri in Florence, entitled The Modern Transformation of the Right to Property. On that occasion, he questioned the existence of a process of transformation that had invested the traditional concept of property, and so it made it possible to see in it a real social function. The most striking sign of this change of perspective was the fact that the union was legally legitimized in the way in which the individual owners exercised their rights. Based on the reading of the special legislation, which was also gathered in Italy, and that aimed at coordinating the private use of goods to public interest to be considered prevalent, Finzi pointed out the fundamental novelty for which the traditional elasticity of the domain was called to face no longer just simple limitation, but positive duties respecting the use of such things, as well as the duty to well-cultivate land ownership. In 1927, a decade after the first confrontation, the enactment of a fascist single legislative measure, known as Labor Charter, offered bootleggers the possibility to revisit their opinion on this subject. Filippo Vassalli, for example, speaking at the first Italian Juridical Congress in October 1932, took up the theme of property rights and gave a comprehensive overview of the legislation promoted by the regime. Discovered both land ownership and the ownership of the means of production, which were significantly affected by state intervention in the economy. Vassalli's report aimed to highlight the new profile of the property under the scrutiny, in line not only with the past and the present development in political and legal thought, but also with the generality of movement evident in other legal systems. The steps of this transformation involved the erosion of the fundamental concept of property rights, resulting from restriction of the owner's power and the narrowing of the range of objects eligible for such right. The resulting scenario seemed to endorse an undeniably new perspective, wherein the concept of functional property, far from being disruptive, served to uphold the property itself. In contrast, Finzi argued that goods were increasingly subject to state regulation, with the interests of the state taking precedence over those of the individual citizen. This represented a profound shift from a human-centered legal framework to one in which production processes centered on the land and enterprise took precedence. He debated that it was now the land, the ship, and the productive enterprise that primarily dictated the contours of private property law in the service of the overarching national interest. This reversal of the relationship meant that property was no longer centered on the individual subject, but was shaped according to the needs of the subject function within the society. In the clear context that Finzi grasped on the early 1930 centuries, property remained a fundamental aspect of the property regime, albeit significantly transformed, thus aligning with its previous foresight. Property no longer reflects individual egoism, but serves a noble and beneficial social function. By the mid-1930 centuries, this new approach sparked debates on agriculture goods, lands, and family dynamics. This discussion would influence the preparatory work for the new civil code. Just 2 years later, at the first National Agrarian Law Congress in 1935, Finzi was struck by the need to deepen the issue raised in 1933. In his report entitled Property Rights and the Regulation of Production, he reinforces the idea that the most significant change in property law were to be found in the regulation of goods. Finzi's analysis introduced a conceptual distinction between the static aspect of ownership of productive goods and the dynamic aspect of their use. This distinction allowed for the recognition of different roles within the ownership framework, including not only the bar owner, but other stakeholders such as mere use of the property. Wherever it is important to acknowledge that this new concept of property faced the challenges in being translated into concrete legal solution, partly due to the inherent limitation of legal language in providing adequate conceptual frameworks. For instance, significant difficulties arose in defining terms such as font, company, and rustic background. The consideration conducted thus for are of paramount importance not only for comprehending the different issues addressed by the 1942 Civil Code, but also for justifying the inclusion of groundbreaking elements concerning agricultural goods and the family business in the final version of the third book of the new Civil Code, which focuses on real right. In this context, significant efforts were made during the preparatory stage of drafting the new Civil Code in order to establish minimum regulatory guidelines for the institution of the silent family community, which historically formed the foundation of family business. In particular, a scheme drawn up by the jurist Fulvio Maroi, the same jurist mentioned by previously the Professor Giacomo Pace Gravina, proposed the extension of the notion of property to the non-agricultural activities. Wherever this proposal was swiftly dismissed due to numerous objections raised by the institutional bodies tasked with providing opinions, notably by certain members of the parliamentary committee. They argued that local customs were better suited to regulate family farms. Subsequent project consolidated the rules on tacit communion in the single Article 2130 of the Civil Code. This provision, which focused exclusively on agricultural activities, stated that family communion in agricultural activities should be regulated by customary practice. In conclusion, it is evident that the outcomes achieved represent a rather modest result for a phenomenon as vibrant and integral to the social fabric as that of family business. This is particularly striking when considering that a significant shift did not occur until the 1975 reform of family law. In fact, only the introduction of Article 230 bis, titled Family Business, into the Civil Code, finally granted the proper legal recognition to the work carried out within the family community. Thank you for your attention.